Welcome to How's That Working For You, a podcast for the therapy curious. I'm your host, Dr. Zoe Krupka. If you're working in one of the many fields of mental health, we've made this space for you. Come join us in some reflection on these often very strange jobs that we do in the hope that we can really get to the heart of how to improve our work and our own sense of how to be who we are within it. This podcast is brought to you by the Cairn Miller Institute. Cairn Miller is founded on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge their deep and enduring connection to land, waters, and community. The legacies of colonization and the ongoing effects of institutional racism have enduring impacts on the mental health and well-being of First Nations people, and we hold this continuing dispossession in our minds and hearts as we explore the question of how to improve our work in the mental health field. We are here today with Dr. Kathomi Gatwiri, who's an associate professor in the Faculty of Health at Southern Cross University, an ARC DECRA Fellow at the Centre for Children and Young People, president of the peak body, the Australian Women and Gender Studies Association, and for our purposes today, a practicing psychotherapist. Kathomi's award-winning interdisciplinary research investigates the intersection topics of racial trauma, belonging, blackness, and migranthood. Her private psychotherapy practice is called Healing Together. The goal of Dr. Kathomi's practice is to support Black people, their families, and relationships to heal from the assaults of trauma and to provide culturally affirming professional support that will enhance their well-being in both personal and professional contexts. Thank you so much for coming in. I feel honored to speak to you today.
Oh, thank you, Zoe.
You're also a Cairn Miller alumni.
I am. Mm. That feels like ages ago.
It was ages ago.
Yeah, when we met.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing that I wanted to start with, I suppose, is your training and your preparation for your work. Because my training had absolutely nothing about racism. I was completely untrained and unprepared when I went out as a psychotherapist in this area. Mm-hmm. I know it's changed somewhat, but my sense of how it's changed as an educator is there is information about the existence of racism, but psychotherapists are still unprepared for, well, what do I do with that? How do I respond to that? Mm. You know, how was that for you? And what did you do with that?
I think I'll talk about it in two ways, because when I came to Cairn Miller, I was an international student who had just freshly arrived, who didn't quite understand. I'd never lived in a white majority society before. Mm. So for me, it was shocking that people would view me as a Black person first, you know? So first of all was my own learning about Blackness and Australia's relationship with Black people and Blackness, particularly Afro-Blackness. So that was my first learning, that, you know, there is a very, very toxic, violent history to work with that. And then the second bit was learning then how that is a form of trauma for people, and what as psychotherapists we are able to understand how racial trauma, how processes of racialization, how white supremacy, how racial genocide affects racially minoritized people. But that was a long learning. For me. It actually took me leaving Cairn Miller and getting my qualifications and starting working to understand what I missed. So while I was there, I didn't understand, because I was still learning about my own Blackness, you know. I didn't quite understand this is something we were supposed to learn, because I was quite new. Maybe people who've lived here might have had a different experience and be able to recognize the gap immediately. For me, I did. It's only when I left that I realized, hang on, how am I supposed to work with what I was given? Because there was so much stuff that we were taught, but it was not for us. It was not for black people. It was not for non-white people. So it almost felt as if I was trained to work with a white Australia. But that is not Australia anymore. Australia is very diverse. The demography is changing. So I didn't feel like I had enough tools to be able to go and work with the people that I wanted to work with and the people who were coming to me for support. So it felt like I had to go and re-educate myself about therapeutic practices that are actually racially safe. But isn't it interesting that I didn't recognize that there was a significant gap until I realized I don't know what to do. But people assumed that I knew what to do because I'm a black person.
Yes.
So it's that sense paradox of being made the expert and the student at the same time and having to carry both of those. I don't know whether you can relate to any experience of that, being a migrant as well and having to learn how a particular space and its relationship with race is.
I think certainly coming to this country, I found the idea or the conversation about race in Australia very behind where I'm from in Canada. So that was one of the first things that I noticed. I suppose the intersection for me in my experience of what you're talking about is being a queer woman and being expected by queer clients to understand theories of queerness in the psychotherapy room, which I did not, and had to get another education. And, you know, like you, that came outside of the psychotherapy world and in the world of, I don't know, activism, of theory. Where did that come for you when you say I had to learn that again? Where?
So for me, when I went to placement and I started working, say, psychotherapeutically, I felt very disconnected with, I remember actually saying, I don't think this is for me. I don't think I'm a good therapist. I don't think I will practice, because the tools I was given were not for me and they were not for my people. So automatically I internalized to say, I'm just a shit therapist and I don't want to harm anybody. I'm just going to go and do what I think I'm more aligned to. And it's not actually until 2020 when George Floyd was murdered. And there was all this overflowing racial grief in our community, and certainly for me, where there was a reckoning around the fact that people are messaging me left and right going, do you know any black therapists who can help us to deal with the racial grief that's coming up for me at the moment? Do you know any other therapists who are anti-racist who can help me figure out how to deal with white colleagues who are telling me it's in my head and I need to move on? And I remember complaining to my partner then, going, God, you know, I wish there were more black therapists. I wish there was a black therapist I could refer people to. And he said, aren't you one? I went, oh, yeah, I guess
Good
so.
point. Yeah.
Good point, you know. And I thought, I'm just going to start with the tools that I have. So I went and got myself registered. I think I reached out to you for some advice during that time. And I just thought, I'm just going to use the tools that I have and meet people from the place of lived experience. I felt like I was very different from 10 years prior, where I felt I didn't have any tools and resources. By now I'd done, spent years doing research on minoritization and racism. I felt I had the theoretical language that I could kind of bring into therapy. So I started healing together. And I remember people telling me, black people don't go to therapy. And I was so happy to be proved wrong, because black people don't want to go to unsafe racist therapists.
Yes.
who gaslight them about their racial experience. They will absolutely go to therapists who understand them and who have the tools and the resources to support their racial experiences of trauma, right? So the first year I was just slammed. I wasn't ready for that.
Hundreds of clients knocking at the
and
door.
a wait list that was so long that I thought, oh God, I think I need to go and upskill myself. So I started enrolling for some courses in America because I couldn't find anything here, to working in a racially safe way, learning about anti-racist theories of psychotherapy, learning about how therapy has harmed communities of color over years, learning about the whiteness of psychology, right? Reading about weird psychotherapy and how experiences of white middle-class people are used to universalize mental health issues for all communities. So that was me looking elsewhere, looking at the UK and looking at America to go and say, what are black therapists or psychologists from these places actually saying about how they do it? That's how I upskilled myself. But also as I worked with clients, I realized actually, I have something to offer. And so that is how I was able to scale some of that expertise for my clientele.
Because kind of when I'm listening to you talking about upskilling, it feels like one of the key things that you're talking about, I'm not sure if this is right, is the need to understand the trauma that's coming from the outside rather than psychotherapy's focus, which is the interior of the client.
Right.
You were, and
Right.
that the way that kind of not just re-traumatizes but pathologizes kind of whole populations. But when you're in the room with someone and you're using that kind of more external lens, what does that look like in practice?
It feels liberating.
Yeah.
Actually, because I think in anti-racist practice there's a difference between peace and liberation. So I feel like sometimes what traditional psychotherapy aims to get is to get people to be at peace with life and to be accepting, to have this radical acceptance. And I can see how that would make sense for a lot of people, but for us as black people, the aim is not peace. Because you can be enslaved and in peace. You can be in all these things and at peace, but we're not working towards peace, we're working towards liberation. And so helping people to understand how living in a society that constantly assaults them, that they're having an appropriate reaction to the level of assault, structural, systemic assaults that they experience every day. And in fact, they have incredible resilience and beauty to have held on to parts of themselves where they still humanize themselves and respect themselves and dignify themselves while still experiencing so many structural and systemic assaults. That's where we start. Because I think some people come to therapy expecting to have pathologization. Tell me what's wrong with me. Tell me why I'm not able to wake up in the morning. Tell me why it's so difficult for me to wake up and brush my teeth and take my kids to school. And what I was recognizing is a lot of people who had gone to traditional therapy, which I mean by traditional I mean Western, all these symptoms were being read as depression and anxiety, and most of them were being medicated for depression and anxiety, which is not to say racial trauma can cause those things, but they're medicating the symptoms. The issue is racial trauma, the issue is racial battle fatigue, right? So when you medicate a depressive symptom, someone not being able to get out of bed, you've still not addressed the fact that the reason that person doesn't want to get out of bed is because they don't want to get out of their house to deal with the sea of whiteness out there, because they never really know which one of the people is going to be safe and which one is going to assault racially. So having those conversations, and you can hear people just being able to, that moment when you go, so it's not me. So this is an appropriate reaction to racism. This is what racial trauma looks like. You're completely fatigued under the weight of racism because you're constantly out there, hyper-vigilant, the burden of proof, the burden of minoritization, being, acting in ways where you're responding to hyper-scrutiny, but also where you're responding to hyper-visibility, where your body never gets a break. Because as a black person, you never get a break. Whether you're at a cafe, whether you're at Coles, whether you're at work, whether you're a professor, whether you're working down the road. And this sense of being hyper-visible all the time because people have a fascinating relationship with blackness. They're curious about it, but they don't engage in liberation conversation with it. And this paradox of being both hyper-visible and invisible at the same time. So you're hyper-visible all the time and you're scrutinized all the time, but you're also invisible when you want dignity, when you want respect, when you want promotions, when you want jobs, when you want relationships, when you want all these things. And I think after a while that takes a toll when you can't just be a human being. You're black all the time, and being black doesn't always mean having positive experiences. I think that takes a toll, and that cannot be medicated by antidepressants. We need to be able to address the root causes of some of these issues, which is not, and I'm not saying it's not depression or it's not anxiety, but I'm just saying there are other things I think which also needs to be taken into consideration in the therapist room.
Because you're really talking about, while you were speaking, I was thinking about the kind of traditional Western model of working with trauma, for instance.
Yeah.
You establish safety first, then you're able to explore.
Right.
And what you're talking about is, there is no establishment of safety outside. This is an ongoing process of aggression, of microaggression that's daily, hourly. And it sounds like what you're talking about in the room is helping people to better identify what is coming, naming what is coming from the outside.
Yeah, to have a language for their experiences, because I think sometimes when you live in a society that constantly gaslights you about your racial experiences, when people are touching your hair and people are telling you you're a diversity hire and people are telling you all these things that diminish you day in, day out. But also when you live in a society that lives in racial denial, it's not so bad here, America is so much worse, we are the most multicultural and just country, and using the language of multiculturalism to completely erase the experiences of racial trauma that racial minorities have. So when you live in the cloud of being gaslit all the time racially, that, you shouldn't be so sensitive about that. Australians love to have a joke. If you need to fit in, you need to be able to take a joke or two. So those pressures to assimilate and the pressures to become as white as possible, basically what the unspoken rule is, don't be too black. The really successful measure of multiculturalism is how are we able to make these foreigners as white adjusting as possible. So for those of us who can't white adjust because we're black, then there is always this paradox of, what parts of us do we need to erase, to mask, to kill off, so that we can have other dignifying experiences in our day-to-day life. And I think part of the other thing in therapy room is actually asking people to revive the parts of themselves that they've had to mask over years, and to connect with those versions, to connect with their language, to connect with their culture, to connect with song and dance, to connect with who they are, even to connect with their blackness, because I think sometimes the tools of white supremacy is to get you to hate, versions of you that are not white, the body that doesn't look white, the accent that doesn't sound Western, all those things. And there's all this internal devaluation about, and so the therapy room is about getting people to connect with respect and with care and compassion and forgiveness to these versions of themselves that they've been told constantly are undesirable and unwanted and not good and not palatable. And that is the process of liberation. So for me, therapy is not really necessarily about, making peace with. It's about getting people to live the most liberated version of themselves. And that doesn't mean it'll be pain-free. It will not be difficult, but to access those versions and to live an authentic life, I guess. We don't always do it successfully, but we try.
Well, it sounds like, to what you're talking about in that space of making space for those kind of masked or marginalized or disowned parts of the self.
Absolutely, and all marginalized people will connect with that experience. It doesn't have to be just about race. Queer people, gay people, disabled people, people who are, neurodiverse will connect with the experience of when you're not the standard, versions of you that you need to chop off and pretend they don't exist so that you can have some semblance of acceptance. So race is one aspect, but there are other versions. Women have needed to do that for generations, people with disabilities, So I think it taps into all versions of minoritized identities, really.
And I think you're also talking about this, to me, what's really a very white Western ideal that I find extraordinary is this idea that we should be able to be fine by ourselves.
Right.
And what you're talking about, I think, is making spaces where people are safe enough to meet those other parts of themselves, to express those other parts of themselves.
That's true. And part of my practice, really, I've tried to make it so that it's as Afrocentric as possible. So when I talk about an Afrocentric philosophy that guides my practice, is really being guided by African knowledge, If I say I want to do a decolonial practice, then just using colonial frameworks, that feels like it's ironic. So I had to go back to African knowledges and philosophies to go, what are philosophies that can guide the way I do work? And I tapped back into the philosophy of Ubuntu, which is I am because you are, and because you are, therefore I am. We cannot exist in isolation. We are not meant to live like this. We are meant to be in community. And we are meant to have belonging. It is belonging that helps us to feel safe and to feel good and to have, quote unquote, a good life. So when community is taken away, when a sense of belonging is taken away, you don't have a person. That's what Ubuntu means. A person is only a person through others. So what that also means is that as you watch your brothers and sisters suffer, you're also suffering. And I think that comes back to the pain and the racial grief that we feel when we watch Black people being humiliated by the state and being incarcerated and being killed by the state. Even though we don't know these people, I don't know George Floyd, but I cried for months, It's that sense of we are all interconnected, both in our joy and also in our suffering. So part of Ubuntu philosophy is to get people to really critique this idea that they are meant to be, that the measure of success is how hyper independent they are in the Western society, and to really go back into seeking community, being intentional about the relationships that they seek, and to go and heal the relationships within their communities. And sometimes that would mean healing relationships with their mothers, with their fathers, with their sisters, you know. And I do know sometimes there's some overemphasis on if you've had bad relationship with a parent. You're like, oh, cut it off, cut them off. You need to protect your peace. See, we're coming back to this idea.
You're toxic. This is a toxic relationship.
And I'm not saying there are no parents that are not toxic, and sometimes they need to be treated as they need to be treated. But I think from an Afrocentric relationship, if you detach yourself from the mother, if you detach yourself from the community, if you cut yourself off, you can't just tell an African, cut your mother off. Because cutting your mother off will mean cut your aunties off, cut your cousins off, cut your networks off, and then you will be standing alone in a forest. A tree that is meant to be nurtured by others is now standing alone. So there are some things that I see being promoted in Western psychology that I don't think would work for us, because you can't just cut off an individual. By cutting off an individual, you have to cut off a community. And we are meant to thrive in a community. So how do I work with my clients to give them the resources to maintain community and to have the kind of self-esteem and self-love to be able to go, that's not for me, but I can work with this. That's a relationship I would like to navigate with care, and also trust myself that if something comes up, I will have the tools to be able to deal with it, rather than, you know, cut relationships off. So some of those, you know, some of the practices that I use, I know would be quite criticized in a Western context, because it'll be like, well, why would you put people back in toxic environments? And I'm like, and why would you want an African to live without a community? We are a collectivist culture. To be alone is to really get this person to die a slow death, essentially. So, yeah.
It's kind, you know, to me also there's the relationship in what you're talking about to, you know, the heart and soul, I think, of psychotherapy, which, you know, in my training, I suppose part of my understanding in systemic family training, for instance, was you can cut someone off. That's fine. That doesn't make the problem go away. In fact, it intensifies the carrying of that relationship.
And the loneliness. And the grief.
Yes.
Yeah.
And kind of, you know, in that discussion that you have around, you know, cut off, and how enamored psychology really is at the moment. I don't know about you, but I have so many people come to me now saying, I need to set some boundaries. I need help to set some boundaries.
Yes.
And it's like, you know, you're saying, yes, you might need help to set some boundaries, but you need help with connection, with reconnecting.
And with relationships.
Yeah.
And yeah. So I think there's something I've been seeing over the last maybe 4 or 5 years, where people are weaponizing therapy language to just sustain their own bad behaviors. You know? You know, so there's this weaponization of therapeutic language to really not take responsibility and ownership, to do the gut-wrenching work of looking in the mirror and seeing ourselves for the fractures that we have internally and trying to heal them. So when people talk about, you know, you've got to cut off toxic members of the family, I need boundaries, or, you know, I need to protect my peace, or that TikTok pop psychology, you know. And then I have people popping into my practice who have consumed so much TikTok pop psychology, and they think, oh, well, you're not a good enough therapist because you're not helping me cut off people. Yeah. And because you've consumed a lot of this white therapist content who do not prioritize communal healing, and it is your responsibility as an individual to heal,
Yeah.
then it's very confusing for people of color who come here and they go, is this, is this good enough? And I think
when
that
everything out there is telling me I should be able to prune myself like a little tree.
Absolutely. And then I'll have a perfect life.
Yeah.
And then once I remove all those problematic people from my life, then I'll be able to have a good life. But really, have we taught you the skills, the resources to be able to build affirming, dignifying relationships? Because especially as racial minorities, if we were to cut off everybody who indignified us, we would have not relationships at all.
Yeah.
So
it'd be a pretty small
it'll
world.
be a pretty small tree that
Yeah.
has been pruned back to the bare bones. So that makes our work a little bit difficult. I don't know what you're observing with the therapy room being infiltrated by pop psychology, and how that's actually sometimes making the therapist room more racially unsafe.
Oh, I think definitely. I see really a focus much more on cutoff, on self-sufficiency, on independence. I think it's white supremacy, but it's also neoliberalism. It's also and the hard thing I find as a therapist in that space, I'm not sure how it is for you, is that I feel often that I'm asking more of my clients. And I can see them going, I didn't come in here for that.
I didn't come here to take responsibility
No.
and to look in the mirror. I came for tools on how to cut off
Yes.
that person.
Yeah.
Makes it difficult.
Yeah. So what about the toll for you, for other Black therapists, for other therapists of color? How do you engage with that?
That was one of the unanticipated, because when I started this in 2020, I was just like, I've got to do it. It felt like a collectivist responsibility.
Yeah.
Right. So I went in quite quickly, probably unprepared. But also this is my area of research. I research racial trauma day in, day out. The toll is enormous when you're working with people who also share your lived experience and who you can just really empathize with, but also know you can't fix the system. There is no solution.
Yeah.
It's not like a bad relationship where you can help someone leave a toxic or abusive relationship. Basically, you're telling them, go out there in the murky, toxic waters again. And I think the paradox of being a therapist who is trying to work from a liberatory anti-oppressive practice, it feels like a moral injury to you, because you know how toxic and corrosive the waters are, but you can't get them out of it. You can't pull them to the shore and say, here is a safe space for you to be able to survive. So the moral injury of working with people, knowing sometimes I just finish a session and I go, God, what's the point?
Yes.
Like, what's the point? Because yes, we've been able to talk about this, and yes, we've been able to dig deep into the patterns of systemic oppression, but they're still returning to that workplace. And even if we work our systems for them to leave that workplace, they will still go to another white workplace.
Yes.
They're still living in a structure of white supremacy. What's the point? So for me, that's what I struggle with the most. I know my clients get a lot from our conversations, because sometimes they just want validation that they're not crazy, that they're not making it up, that they're having an appropriate reaction to what's happening to them. But for me, it's this sense of I'm left with wounding, knowing that, I'm just kind of like, it's like a surface response. It doesn't feel enough. But also the other thing that I try to do is to tell people the truth when they come to therapy. I know I call my practice healing, together. We're here healing, girl, together, both of us. We're both wounded and injured.
Yeah.
But the thing is that we have this real and long conversation of what healing looks like. Because I think sometimes people say, go to therapy and fix that.
Yeah.
Go to therapy and just
Cut that off.
Cut that off and deal with that. And people expect us when we come to therapy that the pain of the bad relationship they had with a parent or a racial trauma will just kind of disappear and it won't be present. And they think, well, I'm still having nightmares about that relationship and I'm still having hypervigilance about going back to that workplace. Does that mean therapy is not working? And we have to have a conversation of what healing looks like. And from my view, it's having a relationship with your pain. It's not wanting to eradicate it. It's not wanting to go, now you've been fixed. It's having a relationship with your pain that is not judgmental, that you can coexist with, especially in a space where the pain will not end because you live in this society. So how can you coexist with that and minimize the level of internalization as much as possible? So you're not internalizing those racist experiences to mean something is wrong about you. But also, and to me that's healing, that's practical healing, where we're not saying it'll go away and it'll never happen, but I can see it happening and I can have a different relationship with it. How does that work for you when you're, because I know you work in grief and loss a lot, where the pain just really never goes away.
People don't like to hear that.
Yeah.
You know, I think about, when you're talking, I think about the really hard distinction between the ideas of resilience that we have now, that in the sense that you're talking about too, withstanding this pain that won't go away, but also challenging that as well. You know, I think of how my grandmother would tell me stories of the carp, you know, the goldfish. Her mother was Chinese and used to tell her these stories about how carp can live in any kind of water. And I really grew up with that idea of resilience, just kind of tough it out. And I see lots of people come to me either with persistent grief and loss or racial trauma who have that idea of, I just have to survive. And how hard it is to be able to say, it doesn't stop. We're not going to fix that pain. And how do you balance that out with, but we will be here together in this place where we're able to name what's happening, what's coming from the outside. The crossover for me with grief and loss is the expectation that when someone's gone, you grieve them and eventually it ends. And of course there are some losses which never go away, and some which maybe even increase in intensity.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the crossover here with racial trauma is when the grief of one experience maybe goes away, but then there's a new one every day. And we can't fix that. And it feels like sometimes, like you were saying, asking too much of clients, where you have then to ask them to rely on their own sense of self, to be able to retain a sense of their own dignity, but also to be proactive in seeking communal relationships where they can be cushioned and blanketed, where they can actually create spaces where they can go and be their whole selves, to be black enough, to be different enough, or not, and they can feel safe. And it might be little moments, and then on Monday they have to go and start again. So some of those things, because I think sometimes what white supremacy does, and I think one of the biggest, most effective tools of white supremacy is separationism. where you're so separated from yourself, but also you're so separated from your community. You're also taught to think other black people are a threat to you, you know, and the more successful you get, the more white adjusted you become. Leave your community behind, move away from that suburb with too many black people, go to the other suburb where you're a demonstration of your ascendancy to whiteness.
Yes.
You know, and creating that sense of being totally separated. And as you separate from others who are like you, essentially also separating from your own Ubuntu, you're separating from your own self. So part of the work is to return people to themselves and to return people to the community, even though the violence within the community persists and within the society persists. If we have a return to self, there is something to start the work with. But if we are starting the work with a person who is not there, who's been completely taken over by the ideology of whiteness or white supremacy, we are not doing work on themselves, we are doing work on a version of themselves that has been co-opted. So the job is much, much difficult because we are trying to return you first to yourself and then start the work. So it feels a little bit more circular, not linear, you know, bits and pieces. Feel like I've confused myself saying that, but it makes sense in my head.
Yeah, well, you know, what I think I'm also getting from what you're saying is, you know, the importance in reframing for the people that you work with their expectations of therapy, that there's part of it of pushing back against pop psychology, against TikTok, against white supremacy that comes in with your client but comes in to the expectation of the relationship. The reconnecting with disowned parts of the self, parts of the self that have been unwelcome.
Right.
And then also a reconnection with community, and that these things are a circular process.
100%.
Yeah.
And there's a philosophy in Africa called the Sankofa philosophy, which is like a mythical bird in Ghana that talks about, it's a bird that flies backwards, you know, it doesn't fly forward, it flies backward. And it's really, the symbolism of that is that it's not wrong to go back to what you have forgotten, and it is not wrong to go back to where you belong. And so part of these practices is reminding black people who they are, because I think the job of white supremacy is telling them what they're not. You're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not competent enough, you're not desirable enough, you're not attractive enough, you know. And the Sankofa work is returning you to yourself and flying backwards to that which you have forgotten. So I try very much to have a non-pathologizing, so I tell them in the first, you know, session, I'm not here to tell you what's wrong with you. I have no interest in pathologizing black people more than the society has already done. I'm here for us to work out a pattern for which you respond to the traumas in your life. And some people respond to that with, you know, hyper performance. Case in point, myself.
Yes, yes.
Hyper performance, and other people just go into a spiral of really toxic relationships, and other people go into this sense of self-devaluation. So different people respond to these things differently. So what we do is, like, we're gonna work out what the patterns for you have been to do self-preservation, and we're going to work out what versions of those are still important for you to continue doing, and what versions of those are harmful and hindering you to connecting with your full self. And I think that's, you know, as I say, I don't have answers. I'm just introducing you to have curiosity about your experiences and to engage with as little judgment as possible with that.
And we can fly backwards together.
That's it. What we had before was not broken, Zoe. What we had before was not deficit. What we had before was not savage, was not primitive, was not unuseful. What we had before was community, was a way in which we solved problems communally, not individually. We had language, we had songs, we had music, we had food, we had a lot of healing practices, right? So it's about getting people to feel okay about flying back, because what we had was okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. Feel okay about flying back. Oh, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Karen Miller is more than just a not-for-profit organization. It's a vibrant community of students, clients, staff, alumni, and generous donors. Our hearts beat for better mental health, which has driven us for over 60 years. At CMI, we believe in a dynamic interplay between training, research, and clinical practice. These three pillars form our triple helix, each strengthening and informing the other as a registered health promotion charity. We've been pioneers in counseling and psychotherapy in Australia, and our purpose is to enhance mental health through accessible psychological services and innovative professional education. That's where How's That Working For You comes in. This podcast is our way of sharing the extraordinary insights, anecdotes, and life lessons from the mental health field. We're pulling back the curtain to offer you a unique peek behind the scenes, aiming to deepen your understanding of this remarkable space. I'm a senior lecturer at CMI. I'm a feminist psychotherapist, supervisor, and researcher. I've worked in agencies and in private practice, and I've trained in a number of modalities, including emotion-focused therapy and existential psychotherapy, and I have a primary interest in anti-oppressive practice. Thank you for listening to How's That Working For You, a podcast for the therapy curious. This has been your host, Dr. Zoe Krupka. This podcast is a space for open conversations, but it's important to remember that what you're hearing are the personal experiences and thoughts of me and of our guests. While we're here to share insights, please don't take any of this as advice. We're all wonderfully unique, so if you have therapeutic concerns, it's best to chat with your healthcare professional. This podcast was brought to you by the Karen Miller Institute. For more information about our organization, the services we offer, and how to donate, visit our website at cmi.edu.au. You can find links and more information about each guest in our episode show notes. Find us on all major podcast platforms and stay tuned for more inspiring episodes.